I missed him by exactly 1 inch, and that was the moment my life stopped belonging to me. The rain over Manhattan sounded like static across the skyline, a soft, endless hiss against steel rooftops and glowing office towers, the kind of night where the city feels half asleep but never truly rests. I lay flat against the cold gravel of a 30-story rooftop, the scope of my rifle steady against my shoulder, my breathing slow and measured the way it had been trained for years. Across the street, through a wall of glass and golden light, stood Damian Cross, the man every intelligence file called untouchable, the man I had been hired to end. He was exactly where the briefing said he would be, standing beside a long conference table in a private penthouse, sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms, dark hair catching the warm chandelier light, while the rest of the room moved carefully around him. Even from hundreds of feet away, something about him pulled attention like gravity. People spoke quieter when he leaned closer. They paused when he glanced up from the table. Power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it simply stands there and lets the world rearrange itself. My finger rested against the trigger. One breath in, one breath out. I had done this before, more times than I could count. My instructors used to say the moment before a shot should feel like silence falling inside your chest. But that night something else slipped into the quiet. Damian Cross lifted his head slightly, not toward the door, not toward the men speaking beside him, but toward the window. Toward me. Not enough to see my face. Not enough to see the rifle. Just enough to make my pulse shift half a beat. It was irrational. Impossible. Yet his eyes moved slowly across the dark skyline like a man who knew someone was watching. I squeezed the trigger anyway. The rifle whispered. The glass spiderweb beside him with a sharp, glittering crack. 1 inch to the left, and the story of Damian Cross would have ended right there under warm chandelier light. Instead, he stepped back calmly, almost thoughtfully, studying the shattered glass as security rushed toward him. No panic. No chaos. Just calculation. Then he did something that made the breath stall in my lungs. Damian Cross smiled. Not at the men around him. Not at the broken window. At the skyline. At the darkness where I lay hidden. It was the smallest curve of his mouth, the kind of expression that said he had just learned something interesting. I packed the rifle in seconds and slipped into the stairwell before the first alarms reached the street. By the time I reached the alley 2 blocks away, the rain had grown heavier, soaking through my jacket and blurring the neon reflections on the pavement. My phone buzzed once in my pocket, the encrypted line reserved for clients. A single message appeared on the screen. Missed. That word alone would normally mean the job was still open. But before I could respond, a second message arrived from a number that definitely wasn't my client. A number I had never seen before. It read, "Next time, Scarlet Hayes, try aiming for the heart." I stopped walking. Rain rolled down the back of my neck as the city traffic hummed somewhere beyond the alley. Only 3 people in the world knew my real name. My client. Myself. And suddenly, Damian Cross. I should have burned the phone and vanished that same minute. That is the first rule when something goes wrong. Disappear before the mistake grows teeth. But I stood there in that narrow Manhattan alley with rain dripping off the fire escapes and the message glowing cold against my palm, reading the same sentence again and again like it might change if I waited long enough. Next time, Scarlet Hayes, try aiming for the heart. The city traffic rolled past the mouth of the alley, yellow taxis sliding through wet streets while a subway rumbled somewhere underground. But for a few long seconds the world felt strangely quiet, like the night itself had leaned closer to listen to my thoughts. Damian Cross knew my name. Not guessed it. Not suspected it. He knew it. I forced my feet to move again, walking toward the corner where my car waited 3 blocks away, every reflection in every window suddenly looking like a possible set of eyes watching me. My training said the same thing over and over. Stay calm. Change direction. Blend into the city. I pulled my hood lower and stepped into the glow of a street lamp where the rain turned to silver lines falling through the air. My phone vibrated again before I reached the crosswalk. Another message. This time it was only 2 words. 72 hours. I stared at the screen as the pedestrian signal blinked from red to white. 72 hours for what? The answer came almost immediately with the 3rd message. We should talk. I let out a slow breath that fogged the cold air. People like Damian Cross did not invite conversations. They controlled them. They arranged them the way a chess player arranged pieces across a board. which meant something had already shifted in a way I did not understand yet. My car sat where I left it, an old gray sedan that looked exactly like every other tired commuter vehicle on the street. I slid into the driver's seat and locked the door, letting the engine idle while rain tapped steadily against the windshield. For the first time since the shot, my hands were not perfectly steady. That bothered me more than the messages. I opened the encrypted tracker on my phone, expecting the usual blank silence from the number that contacted me. Instead, a location blinked slowly on the map. One address. Midtown. Less than a mile away. Whoever sent the messages wanted me to find them. Which meant they were not hiding. Which meant they believed I would come. I almost laughed at that. Assassins do not walk into meetings with the men they are supposed to eliminate. That kind of mistake ends careers very quickly. But as I watched the blinking location, something colder than fear settled into my chest. Damian Cross had already proven he knew things he should not know. My name. My position on that rooftop. And now he was sitting somewhere close enough to watch the same rain falling over the city, waiting. I turned the car onto the wet avenue before I could change my mind. Midtown on a rainy night moves slower than the rest of Manhattan, headlights sliding across puddles while pedestrians hurry beneath umbrellas that bend sideways in the wind. 20 minutes later, the map led me to a quiet side street lined with black SUVs and polished glass towers that reflected the storm like mirrors. I parked half a block away and stepped onto the sidewalk, the rain colder now against my face. The address pointed to a narrow brownstone tucked between two taller buildings. No guards. No security vehicles. No lights except one faint glow. Behind the second-floor window. My instincts screamed that this was a trap. I pushed the door open anyway. The hallway smelled faintly of old wood and expensive cologne. I climbed the stairs slowly, every sense alert to the creak of the floorboards beneath my boots. When I reached the second-floor landing, the door ahead of me was already open. Damian Cross sat inside on a leather chair beside the window, one arm resting casually along the backrest like he had been waiting all evening. The rain traced silver lines down the glass behind him, while the city lights painted shadows across his face. He looked exactly the same as he had through the rifle scope. Calm, focused, completely unafraid. His green eyes lifted to meet mine, and the corner of his mouth curved slightly, the same quiet smile from the penthouse window. Then he spoke in a voice so steady it made the entire room feel smaller. You missed me by exactly 1 inch. I was curious if you would come see why. For a few seconds neither of us moved. Rain slid down the window behind Damian Cross in thin silver lines, while the city hummed somewhere far below the brownstone. I stayed near the doorway with my hands relaxed at my sides, measuring the room the same way I measured every room. One window, one hallway behind me. No other footsteps in the building. No quiet breathing from hidden guards. It was only him, which somehow made the situation more dangerous, not less. Damian studied me like a man looking at a puzzle he had already half solved. His posture stayed easy, one arm draped across the leather chair, but there was nothing careless about the way his eyes moved. He was cataloging details. The water dripping from my jacket. The distance between us. The way my weight balanced evenly on both feet. People usually expected monsters to look like monsters. Damian Cross did not. He looked like someone who belonged in a boardroom overlooking Central Park, not in a silent meeting with the woman hired to remove him from the world. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. The soft click echoed down the hallway like the start of something neither of us could take back. You should have brought security, I said. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. Damian tilted his head slightly, almost amused. Security would have ruined the conversation. I watched him carefully. You already know who I am. He nodded once. Scarlett Hayes. 28 years old. Works alone. No criminal record. No digital footprint that stays in one place for long. His gaze sharpened slightly. You are very careful with your shadows. A quiet chill slid down my spine, but I did not let it show. Then you already know why I am here. His expression changed just enough that I noticed it. Not fear. Not anger. Something closer to curiosity. Actually, he said slowly, I know why someone thinks you are here. That is not the same thing. I took another step into the room, the floorboards creaking softly beneath my boots. Outside, a distant siren drifted through the rain and faded again. The entire city felt far away from that quiet brownstone room. If you understand the situation, I said, then you understand how this usually ends. Damien leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. His eyes never left mine. That is the interesting part. Usually you would not miss. The words hung between us. I could feel the truth inside them. My instructors used to say the same thing. A professional does not make mistakes twice. And yet here I was, standing 3 yards away from the man I had failed to eliminate, having a conversation instead of finishing the job. Damien rose slowly from the chair, not in a threatening way, just enough to stand tall beside the window where the rain blurred the city lights behind him. Up close he looked younger than I expected. Early 30s maybe. Dark hair, calm green eyes, the quiet confidence of someone who had never needed to raise his voice to control a room. "Do you know why I asked you here, Scarlett?" he said. I did not answer. "Because someone paid a great deal of money to point you at me. And that someone made a mistake." I studied his face, searching for the trap hidden inside the sentence. "What kind of mistake?" Damien turned slightly toward the rain-streaked glass, as if watching the city breathe. The kind where the hunter and the target are both supposed to disappear when the dust settles. My pulse shifted half a beat. He looked back at me then, and for the first time the calm certainty in his voice carried a sharper edge. "Which means we both have the same problem. Somewhere in this city, someone arranged for us to destroy each other." The room fell quiet again except for the rain tapping steadily against the window. Damien held my gaze with a faint, thoughtful expression, like he had already accepted the strange partnership forming between two people who should have remained enemies. Then he said the one sentence I did not expect. "Give me 72 hours, and I will prove you were never supposed to survive this job either." The words hung in the quiet room like a thin wire pulled tight between us. 72 hours. I studied Damien Cross carefully, searching his face for the smallest sign of deception, but his expression remained calm, almost patient, as if he had already considered every reaction I might have. Outside the rain grew heavier, tapping steadily against the glass and turning the distant streetlights into blurred gold circles. Somewhere far below a taxi horn echoed and faded again, but inside the brownstone the world had shrunk to the space between the two of us. I crossed my arms slowly, keeping my voice level. "You expect me to believe that someone hired me just to remove a loose end afterward?" Damien did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked toward a small table beside the wall where a single tablet rested. He tapped the screen once and turned it toward me. The display showed a satellite map of Manhattan, filled with small blinking markers scattered across the city like quiet signals in the dark. "These are communications that passed through my network tonight," he said. "Anonymous relays. Encrypted routing. Very careful work." I glanced at the screen, then back at him. "People who want you eliminated tend to be careful." He nodded slightly. "True. But people who want a war are even more careful." I felt a slow tightening in my chest. Damien rested one hand against the table, studying the map as though it were a chessboard he had already memorized. "Whoever hired you wanted a reaction," he continued. "My death would not just remove a man. It would fracture half the alliances holding this city together. Territories would shift. Power would scramble to fill the vacuum." He lifted his eyes toward me again. "And in that chaos, the person who arranged the move would quietly take control of everything left behind." The rain rolled harder against the windows now, a steady whisper that filled the silence after his words. I stepped closer to the table despite myself, studying the glowing map. Even without knowing his operations, I could see the pattern. Signals appearing and disappearing along the waterfront, near financial districts, near transport hubs. Someone had been preparing for something larger than a single assassination. "You are assuming a lot from scattered data," I said quietly. Damien gave a small smile that did not reach his eyes. "I rarely assume anything." That was when he tapped the screen again and another image appeared. A financial transfer record. My pulse slowed as I recognized the encrypted structure immediately. It was the payment channel my client had used. Except this screen showed a chain extending far beyond the wallet that hired me. 3 more layers of accounts. Offshore routing. Corporate shells. Damien watched my reaction carefully. "The money trail did not end with you." It continued. "Someone wanted distance from the decision, which means they planned to erase the middle piece. Me." I finished the thought without meaning to. He nodded once. "And you?" The room fell quiet again except for the rain and the faint hum of the tablet screen. I realized then that Damien Cross had not invited me here to threaten me. He had invited me because he needed the same answer I did. Who had started this game? I lifted my eyes slowly. You still have not explained why you trust me with this information. Damien walked back toward the window where the city lights shimmered through the storm. His reflection hovered faintly in the glass beside the rain. Because if you wanted me dead tonight, Scarlet Hayes, he said calmly, you would not be standing in this room listening to me talk. He turned back toward me then, and there was something sharper in his expression now, something that carried the quiet weight of a decision already made. So here's my offer. 72 hours. We follow the trail together. If I am wrong, you walk away and never see me again. His eyes held mine steadily across the dim room. But if I am right, then the person who hired you did not just target me. They tried to remove the only witness who could expose them. And that means somewhere in this city, someone already believes Scarlet Hayes is not supposed to be alive tonight. I did not answer Damien Cross immediately. The rain against the window had grown steadier, a soft, endless rhythm that made the room feel sealed away from the rest of Manhattan. Somewhere outside, headlights slid through wet streets and vanished again. But inside the brownstone, the only light came from the tablet glowing faintly on the table and the dim lamp beside the wall. 72 hours. That was what he had offered. 72 hours to chase a ghost that had already arranged for both of us to disappear. I studied him carefully, the same way I had studied targets through a rifle scope for years. Damien stood beside the window with the quiet stillness of someone completely comfortable inside danger. His posture remained relaxed, one hand resting against the glass while rain traced thin silver lines past his reflection. People like him did not survive long by trusting strangers. Yet here he was offering information that could dismantle half the power structure of the city if it was real. Or it could be the most elegant trap I had ever walked into. I stepped closer to the table and looked again at the map on the screen. The blinking markers still pulsed quietly across Manhattan like a silent network breathing beneath the streets. If you are lying, I said slowly, this is a very complicated story to invent. Damien gave a small thoughtful nod. The truth usually is. I glanced toward the window where the skyline shimmered through the rain. My client had never shown a face. Only encrypted messages. Only payment routed through layers of accounts designed to dissolve if anyone tried to follow the trail. At the time, that level of caution felt normal. Now it looked different. Now it looked like distance. Someone hiding behind too many walls. You traced the payment chain tonight, I said. Damien shook his head once. I traced it weeks ago. That answer made me look up sharply. Weeks. His green eyes held mine without hesitation. I knew someone would eventually try to remove me. The question was who would make the first move. A quiet chill moved through my chest. So you waited. He nodded. And when the attempt finally happened, I needed to know whether the person pulling the trigger was the enemy or another piece on the board. The rain continued tapping steadily against the glass as the meaning of that sentence settled into the room. Damien Cross had been expecting someone like me long before the rifle appeared on that rooftop. I crossed my arms slowly. That means you let the situation happen. You allowed someone to send an assassin. Damien did not look away from my gaze. I allowed someone to reveal themselves. The difference matters. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us felt different now. Not hostile. Not calm either. More like two strangers realizing they had both stepped into the same storm from opposite sides of the street. I walked toward the window and stopped a few feet away from him, looking out over the city. The rain had turned the skyline into a field of blurred light stretching miles in every direction. Somewhere out there was the person who had hired me. The person who now believed I had already finished the job. You said 72 hours, I said quietly. Damien nodded once. Enough time to follow the financial trail and identify the network moving behind it. And if we find nothing? His answer came without hesitation. Then you walk away and we never meet again. I watched the rain sliding down the glass, thinking about every rule I had ever followed. Never trust a target. Never stay in the same place after a failed mission. Never let curiosity replace caution. Yet the map on the tablet and the payment chain on the screen told a story that was too precise to ignore. Finally, I turned back toward him. 72 hours, I said. Damien's expression did not change much, but there was the faintest shift in his eyes, like a chess player watching a piece move exactly where he expected. Good. He reached for the tablet and tapped the screen again, bringing up a new location blinking near the East River docks. Our first lead appeared 3 hours ago. Cargo manifests, financial transfers, encrypted communication towers. Someone is moving assets tonight. I followed his gaze to the glowing marker on the map. The storm outside was growing stronger now, wind rattling the window frames and pushing rain sideways through the dark streets. Damien Cross looked back at me calmly. Then I suggest we start before the trail disappears. The rain had turned the streets into rivers of reflected light by the time we stepped outside the brownstone. Manhattan at night always feels alive, but storms give it a different pulse, slower and heavier, like the city is breathing through water. Damien Cross walked beside me down the narrow sidewalk with the same calm pace he had shown inside the room, his coat dark against the rain, his attention moving quietly across the street without appearing nervous. A black sedan waited at the curb with the engine already running, its headlights glowing softly through the falling rain. I stopped beside it and glanced at him. You planned this quickly. Damien opened the passenger door without hesitation. I planned it before you arrived. I studied the vehicle for a moment before getting inside. Old habit. Clean interior. No visible weapons. No hidden figures in the shadows. Only the low hum of the engine and the faint smell of leather seats warmed by the heater. Damien slid into the driver's seat and pulled the car smoothly into the slow-moving traffic. The windshield wipers swept back and forth in steady rhythm as we turned onto a wider avenue. Midtown faded behind us in a blur of wet glass towers and glowing signs while the road carried us east toward the darker edges of the city. Neither of us spoke for several blocks. I watched the passing streets carefully, noting the routes he chose. Not the fastest path. The safest. Side roads. Controlled turns. Damien Cross drove like someone who had spent years understanding how cities move at night. Finally, I broke the silence. The docks by the East River handle hundreds of cargo transfers every week. Why would your lead be there tonight? Damien kept his eyes on the road as a truck rolled slowly past in the opposite lane. Because whoever hired you moved money through shell companies connected to shipping logistics. Tonight, one of those companies scheduled a late transfer. His voice stayed calm, almost conversational. Large enough to move equipment. Small enough to avoid attention. I looked through the rain-streaked window toward the distant river lights beginning to appear ahead. You think the person behind this will be there? I think someone connected to them will be there. That is enough for a beginning. The car rolled beneath an overpass where the rain echoed loudly against the concrete above us before fading again. Streetlights along the riverfront cast long pale reflections across the wet pavement. The East River docks stretched ahead in rows of warehouses and metal cranes silhouetted against the cloudy night sky. Damien slowed the sedan and turned into a quiet side street overlooking the harbor. Cargo containers stacked in tall rows formed dark corridors beneath the storm clouds, while distant ship horns echoed across the water. He parked the car beneath a flickering street lamp and switched off the engine. The sudden quiet felt strange after the steady hum of the drive. For a moment, we both watched the river moving slowly beyond the docks. Rain tapped softly against the roof of the car. You still have time to walk away, Damien said without looking at me. His tone was calm, but there was something thoughtful beneath it. If this situation is larger than we expect, your safest option is distance. I let out a quiet breath and looked toward the dim rows of cargo cranes rising over the waterfront. If the person who hired me planned to remove both of us, distance will not help. Damien nodded slightly, as if he had expected that answer. Then we stepped carefully. He reached into the console and pulled out a small tablet, bringing up the same blinking map we had seen earlier. One marker pulsed steadily just 2 blocks from where we sat. The signal appeared 20 minutes ago. He glanced toward the dark shapes of the warehouses. Someone is transmitting data from that building, probably coordinating the shipment. I followed his gaze across the dockyard where faint lights glowed behind the high windows of one warehouse near the water. Rain drifted across the empty loading lanes like thin smoke. The entire harbor felt strangely quiet, like the moment before something begins moving. Damien closed the tablet and looked at me with the same steady focus he had carried all night. Ready to see who arranged this game. I opened the door and stepped into the cold rain, the smell of salt water and diesel hanging in the air as the storm rolled across the river and the first hour of our 72 began. Cold rain slid down the back of my neck the moment my boots touched the pavement. The docks at night always carried a strange stillness, a mix of salt water, diesel, fuel, and distant machinery that never fully slept. I closed the sedan door quietly and looked toward the warehouse Damien had indicated. 2 stories tall, steel walls faded by years of weather, its windows glowing faintly through the rain like tired eyes watching the harbor. The river stretched beyond it, black and restless beneath the storm clouds. Damien stepped beside me, pulling his coat collar slightly higher against the wind. For a man who ran half the city, he moved with almost invisible precision. No wasted motion, no heavy footsteps, just quiet awareness in the way his gaze swept across the dockyard. Cargo containers towered in dark rows around us, forming narrow corridors of shadow between the loading lanes. Somewhere in the distance a ship horn echoed low across the water, long and lonely. I glanced at him. If someone inside that building is coordinating a shipment, they will not be alone. Damien nodded slightly, his eyes still tracking the dim lights along the warehouse roofline. That is why we are not walking through the front door. I followed his gaze and noticed the metal stairway running along the side of the structure, leading up to a narrow service platform beneath the second-floor windows. Rain clattered softly against the steel steps as the wind shifted. "You think the transmitter is upstairs?" I said quietly. "Most likely." Damien pulled the small tablet from his coat and tapped the screen once. The blinking marker on the map hovered almost directly above the second-floor office space. Someone is sending encrypted signals every 3 minutes. That usually means coordination, not conversation. I watched the windows carefully. No movement behind the glass. Only pale light and the slow sway of shadows inside the room. Whoever was working there had not noticed 2 strangers standing across the loading lane in the rain. Yet, we crossed the pavement together, keeping close to the stacked containers where the shadows grew deeper between the yellow dock lights. The rain softened our footsteps, turning the sound of the harbor into a steady curtain of water. When we reached the metal stairway, Damien stopped and rested one hand against the railing. I allowed a faint smile to touch the corner of my mouth. My work has always been complicated. Damien studied me for a second longer, then nodded once and began climbing the steps. The metal staircase rattled softly beneath the rain as we moved upward toward the second-floor platform. From that height the harbor stretched wider across the darkness, cargo cranes rising like silent skeletons against the cloudy sky. I crouched beside the window and wiped a small circle of rain from the glass with my sleeve. Inside, a single desk lamp illuminated a cluttered office filled with shipping manifests, computers, and communication equipment. One man sat at the desk typing steadily, while a second monitor flashed with incoming data. I glanced toward Damien. "You were right. Someone is transmitting." Damien leaned closer to the glass, his expression sharpening slightly as he studied the screens. Lines of financial codes scrolled across the monitor in rapid sequence, accompanied by cargo registry numbers and coordinates along the river. His voice dropped to a near whisper. "That is not a simple shipment schedule." I watched the data flash across the screen and felt the slow realization settle in my chest. "What is it?" Damien exhaled slowly, eyes still fixed on the monitor. "That is a list of financial transfers connected to multiple shipping companies, each one linked to accounts that moved money through the same network that paid you." The rain tapped softly against the platform railing as the weight of that discovery settled into the quiet space between us. I kept my voice low. "How many companies?" Damien's answer came just as quietly. "Enough to move control of half the harbor without anyone noticing until it is too late." Inside the office the man at the desk paused, reaching for a stack of printed manifests beside the computer. Damien watched him carefully, his mind already racing several moves ahead. Then he murmured something that made the entire situation feel suddenly larger. "Whoever arranged this is not just planning to remove me. The harbor walls." Inside, the man at the desk continued typing, unaware that 2 strangers were studying every line of data passing across his screens. I watched the scrolling numbers carefully, the patterns beginning to make sense now that Damien had pointed them out. Shipping registries, container numbers, transfer codes tied to financial accounts moving through layers of companies that technically had nothing to do with each other. But when the lines were traced far enough, they all curved back to the same invisible center. I leaned closer to the glass. "That list is growing." Damien followed the movement of the screen and nodded once. "They are consolidating assets. Every few minutes another company appears on the ledger." The rain slid down the window between us and the room, blurring the lamplight for a moment before the droplets fell away again. The man inside paused and reached for his phone, glancing down at a message before returning his attention to the computer. Whoever he was, he moved with the focus of someone used to quiet work done late at night. I lowered my voice. If this ledger connects the companies that paid me, then this person is coordinating something larger than a harbor transfer. Damien watched the numbers carefully, his expression growing more thoughtful with each new line of data. Yes, he said quietly. They are building control over supply routes. A faint nod. And we need it quickly. Inside the office, the man stood and stretched slightly, reaching for a stack of shipping manifests near the printer. For a moment, his chair rolled back far enough that the monitor tilted toward the window. The display revealed a map similar to the one Damien had shown me earlier, except this one contained dozens of blinking points scattered across the city's waterfront. My breath slowed as I counted them. That is more than one warehouse. Damien saw it too. His voice dropped lower than the rain. They are preparing multiple transfer points. The realization settled over us like the weight of the storm clouds above the harbor. This was not a single operation hidden inside one quiet warehouse. It was a network spreading across the river terminals while the rest of the city slept. I looked toward Damien. Your 72-hour clock just became more important. He gave a slight nod, eyes still fixed on the monitor. Yes, because if those transfer points activate before we identify the person behind them, control of the entire waterfront will change hands overnight. The man inside the office finished reviewing the manifests and reached toward the transmitter again, preparing another signal. Damien leaned closer to the window, studying the equipment carefully as the rain continued to whisper against the steel platform. Then he spoke quietly, the words carrying a calm certainty that made the situation feel sharper than before. If we want answers, Scarlet Hayes, we are going to need what is stored inside that computer before the next signal leaves this building. Means whatever information we want disappears deeper into the system. The wind shifted along the dockyard and rattled the loose metal railing beside us. Down on the loading lanes, the storm had driven most activity away, leaving only the low glow of security lamps reflecting across wet pavement. The entire harbor felt suspended between breaths. I glanced at Damien. If we enter that room, the transmitter will record the interruption. Damien considered that quietly. His mind worked fast, but nothing about his movements suggested panic. Instead, he studied the layout inside the office, the desk, the cables running beneath it, the printer beside the wall. Then his gaze returned to the small green transmitter, slowly, and stepped inside the hallway without hesitation. Outside intensified against the warehouse roof. The blinking marker on the tablet remained steady, revealing the signal's destination with quiet precision. Then Damien spoke the one sentence that made the entire plan feel more dangerous than before. The person behind this operation is not hiding on the waterfront. They are hiding in the center of the city. The rain followed us back into the hallway like a distant whisper against the warehouse walls, while the green light on the transmitter continued blinking calmly behind us, as if nothing unusual had happened. The man at the desk remained seated, still trying to understand what he had just witnessed, but Damien Cross did not give him another glance. Damien moved toward the door with the same measured calm he had carried all night, the tablet in his hand now displaying the signal trace that had revealed the true destination of the network. Midtown, the center of the city, not the waterfront, not the docks, somewhere far more secure. I followed him back onto the metal platform outside where the rain cooled the air instantly against my face. The harbor stretched into darkness beneath the storm clouds while cranes and cargo ships stood silent along the river. Damien paused beneath the narrow awning and studied the tablet screen again, confirming the coordinates with the quiet focus of someone verifying a calculation that could change everything. That location is not random, he said softly. I stepped closer to the screen. The signal marker blinked steadily over a cluster of buildings near the financial district where glass towers stood shoulder to shoulder like a wall against the sky. That area contains dozens of corporate offices, I said. Financial firms, law groups, private investment companies. Exactly. Damien turned the tablet slightly, so the signal trace became clearer. Whoever arranged the shipping network needed access to financial infrastructure capable of moving large amounts of money without attracting attention. Midtown provides that protection. The rain slid across the harbor in long gray sheets while the distant lights of the city shimmered through the storm. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The scale of the situation had shifted again. This was no longer a quiet operation hidden in warehouse shadows. The person orchestrating the network had placed themselves in the most protected part of Manhattan. I leaned against the metal railing and watched the river currents moving slowly. Beneath the dock lights. If the control node is inside Midtown, then the network reaches farther than the waterfront. Damien nodded once, which means tonight was only the beginning. He glanced back toward the warehouse office where the transmitter continued its quiet work behind the glass. That operator will report nothing unusual. The signal completed normally, but the person receiving the transmissions will eventually notice the trace we added. I crossed my arms against the rain, which means they will realize someone is following the trail. Damien met my gaze with a calm expression that carried a faint edge of approval. Yes, and that will force them to accelerate whatever they plan next. The storm wind moved across the dockyard again, rattling loose chains on nearby cargo containers. Somewhere along the harbor, a ship engine started slowly, the deep sound rolling across the water like distant thunder. I looked back toward the glowing skyline rising beyond the river. The blinking marker on Damien's tablet hovered over one specific tower among the cluster of buildings. The structure stood taller than most around it, its upper floors disappearing into the low clouds. That building houses several investment firms, I said quietly. Damien studied the name displayed beneath the coordinates and gave a slight nod. One of those firms recently acquired 3 of the shell companies connected to the payment chain that hired you. I felt a slow tension settle in my chest. Then the person behind the operation is not just hiding in Midtown. They are hiding inside legitimate business infrastructure. Damien slipped the tablet back into his coat pocket as the rain continued falling across the harbor, which means approaching them will require more than a quiet visit to the docks. I watched the city lights flicker through the storm while the realization became clear. Whoever had arranged the attempt on Damien Cross had built their plan carefully, hiding behind money, companies, and influence that stretched through the most powerful districts in Manhattan. Finally, I turned toward Damien. If the signal leads to that tower, how do we enter a place like that without drawing attention? Damien's expression remained calm, but there was something thoughtful in the way his eyes moved toward the distant skyline. That depends, Scarlet Haze, on whether the person inside believes you already completed the job they hired you to do. The rain eased slightly as we returned to the sedan, leaving the harbor wrapped in a thin gray mist that drifted between the cargo cranes and the silent containers. Damien started the engine and guided the car back onto the quiet road along the river while the windshield wipers swept slowly across the glass. The docks disappeared behind us in the rearview mirror, their dim lights fading as Manhattan rose ahead through the storm clouds like a wall of glass and steel. Neither of us spoke for the first few minutes of the drive. The blinking marker on Damien's tablet had already changed the direction of the night. Midtown. Whoever orchestrated the attempt on his life had chosen to operate from the safest and most powerful part of the city. I watched the skyline growing larger through the rain. If the person inside that tower believes the job is finished, they will expect proof, I said quietly. Damien nodded slightly as the car merged onto a wider avenue. Correct. People who commission work like yours rarely trust words alone. They expect confirmation. I turned toward him. Then they will want to hear from me. Damien glanced at me briefly before returning his attention to the road. Exactly. The city lights reflected across the wet pavement as traffic moved slowly through the storm. Yellow taxis passed in streaks of color, while the towering buildings of Midtown grew taller above us with every block. I rested my elbow against the door and studied the glowing skyline ahead. My client had never shown a face. Every message had arrived through encrypted channels that disappeared after being read. If we contact them directly, I said, they may suspect something. Damien considered that for a moment. Suspicion is unavoidable. The key is to control how quickly it appears. The car turned onto a quieter street lined with tall office buildings whose upper floors vanished into the low clouds. Damien slowed near the curb and parked beneath a row of dark windows. Across the street, the tower from the signal trace rose high above the other buildings, its glass surface reflecting the storm like a shifting mirror. Even at that late hour, several floors remained brightly lit. I studied the building carefully. Security cameras near the entrance. A private parking structure beneath the street level. Dozens of offices inside belonging to companies that handled more money in a day than most people would see in a lifetime. Damien switched off the engine and leaned back slightly in the seat. If your client believes Damien Cross is already gone, they will likely arrange a meeting to finalize the transfer of payment, or to close the remaining details of their plan. I watched the illuminated floors of the tower, which gives us a way inside. Damien gave a faint nod. Yes, but timing will matter. If we contact them too soon, they may question why the signal network has not completed its next phase. If we wait too long, they may begin searching for other explanations. I took a slow breath and felt the quiet tension building between the two of us. For the first time since the night began, the next step would not involve hidden observation or silent tracing of data. It would involve stepping directly into the path of the person who had tried to erase both of us from the board. I pulled out my phone and opened the encrypted channel where my client's messages had appeared earlier that evening. The screen remained blank for a moment. Damien watched calmly beside me. Ready to play the role they expect? He asked. I glanced toward the towering building across the street where the lights still burned through the storm. If they believe the job is finished, I said quietly, then they are about to hear from the only witness they never planned to leave alive. My thumb hovered above the message screen for a second longer before I began typing the words that would pull the hidden architect of this entire operation into the open. I pressed send and watched the encrypted message disappear into the network like a stone dropped into dark water. For a few seconds, nothing happened. The rain slid slowly across the windshield while Midtown traffic moved quietly through the late-night streets, taxis gliding past pools of reflected light and office towers glowing above us like watchful giants. Damien Cross remained still in the driver's seat beside me, his attention shifting between the building across the street and the silent screen in my hand. The tower rose 30 stories into the low clouds, its upper windows fading into the storm like distant stars. Somewhere inside that building, someone believed their most dangerous problem had already been solved. My phone vibrated softly against my palm. A new